Chapter 10. For years I was convinced that most of my problems could have been averted had I been allowed to join the Boy Scouts. All the neighborhood boys belonged. They spent hours on our back steps discussing the privileges of membership, explaining the tests designed to make boys self-reliant, and reciting the Boy Scout oath. On my honor, I will do my best. The biggest advantage, according to them, was that girls were not allowed to join this honorable organization. Girls aren't even allowed to look into the Boy Scout catalog, they'd say, showing off treasures they had ordered and received in the mail, addressed directly to them. Merit badges, pins, neat cooking sets that opened out into every imaginable container, and then folded up again, if the complicated process could be managed. Although girls were not allowed to touch, we were greatly encouraged to sit through the demonstrations. Of all the amazing items of Boy Scout equipment, the most treasured was the Boy Scout knife. Dunny and Port boldly pulled out the gleaming blades, explaining each one individually. "This is the can opener," Port said, pulling out a hooked blade. "We use it when we're out in the jungle and haven't killed a grizzly bear yet." On the rare occasions when Port smiled, he was handsome, but he generally wore a crooked sneer. "And this is the fish blade," said Dunny. "We use it to cut out the guts." Dunny's shallow complexion would cause one to wonder how he could stomach cutting the guts out of anything. He was usually mild-mannered, but in Port's presence he assumed an aggressiveness that was rarely displayed otherwise. Florence interrupted. "My mama says you're not supposed to use the word guts." Unfortunately, this only encouraged the boys to undertake greater dramatic efforts. "Sometimes we don't even cut out the guts. We just let 'em swim down our gullets," Dunny said. "And if you don't be quiet, I'll throw you into the old chicken house," Port threatened. I finally summoned my courage. "My mama says you're not supposed to throw us into the old chicken house." "We're not afraid of your mama," Port growled. "And we're not afraid of the old chicken house." He grabbed me and with little effort forced me onto the ground. I squirmed, trying to cover up my hideous black bloomers. He held his knife over me, uttering the dreaded words that we had first heard from the Holly Street gang. "If you don't do what I say, I'll cut a hole in you and all your blood'll run out." Fleur demanded angrily that Port let me up. "I thought Boy Scouts are supposed to be kind and help people." "The Boy Scout book doesn't say we have to be nice to girls." Port finally let loose of me as he addressed Fleur. "And if I cut out your freckles, and your blood will run out too." Dunny, as usual, steered the conversation onto a more intellectual level. The reason they made Boy Scouts in the first place was to help old men find addresses in the London fog, and we help old ladies that get lost in the jungle and... Portis was not so intellectually inclined. "And we're supposed to kill the lions and tigers the old ladies have been fighting. And we have compasses to tell them which way is north." "Yeah, and if they're too tired to go north, we build a fire without matches and take out our cooking set and cook them some meat and potatoes." I wasn't much interested in cooking meat and potatoes, but when I witnessed building fires without matches, I thought that it was the most marvelous feat I'd ever seen. Though I was aware that one might die of starvation before a tiny spark could be generated and coaxed into a flame by feeding it gently with cedar chips. I could see little practicality to this miracle, however, because Boy Scouts always had plenty of matches in the little containers which were designed to keep dry when scouts went swimming across rivers full of dangerous creatures. In spite of my skepticism, I longed to perform this magical fire-building trick, but of course I couldn't, because I was a girl. Mama was often a witness to these tussles. She didn't like to see the boys taking advantage of us, and she and Mrs. McNabb argued about it. Then she would report to Papa. "Mrs. McNabb is prejudiced. Can you imagine? She says the boys wouldn't tease the girls if the girls didn't encourage it." Papa said, "Well, maybe you're prejudiced too, seeing as you have only girls." We didn't like that. It sounded like he was siding with Mrs. McNabb. Actually, the boys weren't much enthused about cooking meat and potatoes either. They preferred playing Tarzan, swinging through the trees and screeching in a high-pitched, oscillating voice. Of course, we girls weren't allowed to play Tarzan, but we were allowed to play Jane, which meant we just had to wait around to be rescued. Actually, we never got rescued, but Port often threatened me. "Do you know what Tarzan does to Jane when he gets her in the woods?" I couldn't imagine. "Well, I know. And if you don't watch out someday..." I was terrified of Port. He was big and strong and could bend my arms into painful positions and demand that I yell uncle. One day I had an encounter with Port that caused me to fear being out in the yard alone. I was lying in the hammock that Papa had hung in the madrona trees below the house. It was a beautiful warm day, and I had sneaked out from doing my chores. I was pushing myself with one foot, while the other leg was draped over the side of the hammock, helping me keep my balance. Portus suddenly appeared and began to jerk on the ropes. He demanded that I move over so he could get in beside me. I refused. He began pushing the hammock harder. "I'll jump in on top of you. You know what'll happen then." The only thing I could think of was that he would cut me with his knife so that all of my blood would run out. By now, I was being pushed so high that I was hanging on for dear life. I was ready to beg him to stop and let him in when I heard Mama calling. In a few seconds, Flora appeared on the porch above. Her voice was accusative. "What are you doing out here? You're supposed to be in the house." Port let the hammock die down, and I fumbled with my skirt, trying to work my way out of the jumpy hammock. As I ran toward the stairs, Port called in a low, husky voice, "Someday we'll go up in the woods together and take off all our clothes." When I came into the table, I was feeling so guilty that I couldn't raise my eyes. Mama remarked that I should have been doing my chores instead of being in the hammock. Flora accused me. "What were you doing with your legs apart? I could see your black bloomers." Mama repeated that nice girls always kept their legs together. I could come to only one conclusion. I was bad. I had sneaked out alone and enticed Port. To give Mrs. McNabb her credit due, she admitted she didn't like having the boys swinging in the trees and hollering at the tops of their lungs any more than we did. We could hear her cautioning Dunny about letting Robbie play Tarzan and climb up high in the trees. Robbie liked climbing up high. "He's always up a tree someplace," Papa said. "And I don't think he's an especially good climber," Mama said. Everyone in the neighborhood said, "He's certainly no Tarzan." When Mother came that summer and saw Robbie in the trees, she reported that she had just completed a course in first aid. "It looks like I may get a chance to use it," she said. "I hope not," Mama said. One day Flora and I were sitting on the back steps when we heard Robbie screaming. We looked up and there he was in the big maple tree. The loop on his knickers was caught on a branch, and he was hanging in midair, unable to help himself. We started screaming, which brought everyone out of their houses. By the time we arrived on the scene, Dunny was scrambling up the tree, and Mrs. McNabb, breathless from running, gasped, "Grab him! Pull him! Into the trunk! And—" It is possible that Dunny didn't hear any of the instructions due to all the screaming. In any case, it was apparent that he realized that since he was in charge, he was taking charge. He climbed out on a branch just above Robbie, and before anyone could say Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Robbie was having a great fall. But not the wall his mama had hoped. He hit the ground with a loud thud, rolling around and hanging onto his foot. Instead of quieting down, he began screaming worse than ever. Mother headed for the rescue, obviously hoping for an opportunity to use her newly learned skills, but Mrs. McNabb motioned her away. All Mother was able to do was pronounce, "He broke his foot." We all felt proud later when the doctor confirmed Mother's prognosis. However, we felt sorry that Robbie had to spend the summer on crutches. We called him Tenderfoot, even though Dunny and Port said he couldn't be a tenderfoot since he wasn't old enough to be a Boy Scout. Dunny assumed the role of the hero, claiming that he had cut Robbie down with his Boy Scout knife. But since I never actually witnessed any flashing blades, I can't attest to that. Dunny also claimed he had been able to perform the daring rescue because he had remembered the Boy Scout motto, "Be prepared." I asked Papa what prepared meant. He said, "Franny, it's something you ain't never been and ain't never going to be." I knew that. How could I be prepared if I wasn't ever allowed to join the Boy Scouts? While Robbie was still on crutches, he and I would sit on the back steps, pondering world problems. One day, Robbie said, "What do the big kids do when they go in the woods?" Going into the woods had been a common topic amongst the older kids of the neighborhood as far back as I can remember. For some reason that I could never actually verify, I suspected that Flora and Kat had gone into the woods with Dunny and Port and maybe Clean Steve. As for me, however, I had never dreamed of such a thing. Until now. I took his question as a compliment and a responsibility. Robbie had always looked up to me as a big sister, and I had always felt obligated to further his growth. Why, I had taught Robbie how to ride a kitty car and how to cut out paper dolls from the Sears Roebuck catalog. He had become much better at this than me, because he, being very precise, took his time to work the scissors around the arms and legs. On the other hand, I was more interested in quantity than quality, because I figured that Dora would just tear the dolls up anyway. I answered his question with a great display of truthfulness. They take all their clothes off. What for? To see what they look like without their clothes on. This topic was kicked around during our gab sessions. One day, after he had thrown away his crutches and was walking almost like normal, the idea seemed to strike Robbie suddenly. Let's go see what we look like without our clothes on. Briefly, I pondered the what-ifs. What if we got caught? Further pondering might have revealed one of the world's great truths regarding proposals, namely, it's not so much the content of a proposal, but the way in which that proposal is presented, and by whom. For instance, when Port had broached the subject, I had been horrified. But when gentle little Robbie did, I was going along with him into the woods. Once we had settled down on a couple of rocks under a big maple tree, Robbie approached the job with no qualms. As I watched him strip down, it occurred to me that I had never seen what boys wore under their knickers, but I didn't have time to ponder that until later. By the time we were almost disrobed, I was feeling so guilty that I could hardly give Robbie more than a passing glance. What I was able to see confirmed my suspicions that there was no appreciable difference between girls and boys. So why couldn't girls join the Boy Scouts? Any attempts I might have considered taking to investigate further were thwarted by the sound of Mrs. McNabb's voice calling out to Dunny. Go and find your little brother. He is your responsibility, you know. Robbie and I began to fumble. That's when I realized, as did everyone else in the neighborhood, that Robbie still had not learned to tie his shoelaces. I began to help, but, as everyone also knew, I was no great shakes at tying shoelaces either. When I heard sounds in the underbrush, I shuffled into my own shoes and deserted. My arrival home in my disheveled state was hardly noticed. After all, that was an everyday occurrence. Mrs. McNabb, however, had suspicions, which she reported to Mama over the back fence. Mama, of course, couldn't believe that her little Franny would do what Mrs. McNabb was accusing her of, so they had a fight and didn't talk for a week. Robbie was forbidden to come over, so I was left to sit on the back steps and ponder alone. As a result, I asked Fleur, how come the whole world gets to see girls' bloomers, but they never see boys' underwear? Fleur asked for further enlightenment. I said, when Miss Knight spanks the girls, she pulls up their dresses so the whole world can see their bloomers. But when she spanks the boys, she doesn't pull down their knickers? Fleur didn't have an answer. That winter we became aware of another handicap of being girls. When the snow fell, Flo begged for a sled like the other kids have. Papa headed for the hardware store. By God, my kids are going to learn to sled. He came home with lumber and bolts and rope. Later, he presented us with a big, solid, gray box-looking thing. This won't throw you off very easy. Papa pulled us around the front yard the first day, then turned the job over to Mama, who complained that the sled was harder to move than the kitchen stool. Papa had a solution. He hooked the sled to the back of the car and pulled us along Seward Park Avenue. We thought it was great fun, until he stopped at Morgan Hill where the boys were sledding. The boys gathered around with their new sleds. Oh, what magnificent objects they were. Beautiful curved metal runners, varnished top with red stripes, and the name Silver Streak. Ordered from the Boy Scout catalog, I figured. When they saw our homemade contraption, they laughed. If you ever ride that thing down Morgan Hill, you'll be in big trouble, because you have to turn at the bottom. And boy, if you don't, you're dead. But you'll never get the nerve to go down Morgan Hill because you're girls,